Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming to the launch of Retail Therapy, making the case for wider share ownership. The format of this is that myself, Liz and the Minister will each make some brief remarks, with Liz coming on first. We don't have the ability to do a Q&A, I'm afraid, but we'll have some time for networking afterwards, so if there's any of us that you'd like to collar, please come and do so. Before I invite Liz onto stage, I just want to thank everyone for being here today, and particular thanks to the various people who myself and Gerard and other people spoke to in the process of researching this report. We've had some really invaluable contributions, and hopefully people like the thrust and the content of the report, but that's because of the great contributions that we had from a lot of people we were lucky enough to speak to. So thank you for that. Thank you very much to the Minister for attending today. I know we all look forward to hearing what he has to say. But the biggest thanks is to PIMFA and to Liz for backing this project, for sponsoring it, and for not just sponsoring it financially, but also sponsoring it with their wise support and wise counsel. They've been absolutely invaluable and brilliant partners for us. So thank you very much, Liz. So without further ado, I'll invite Liz to take the stage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Delighted to see you. So I'm Liz Field. I'm the Chief Executive of PIMFA, which is the Personal Investment Management and Financial Advice Association. It's the trade association for wealth managers, financial advisors and planners. And we've got about 7,000, or in fact over 7,000 members, and they look after 1.6 trillion in savings and investments for individuals, families and charities. And what they do is they help individuals and families buy their first home through to retirement, all points in between and beyond. Excuse me. There is though a kind of a fundamental question for us. Firstly, our purpose as the Trade Association is to champion a culture of thriving health, thriving financial health. And we often ask ourselves the question, how do we go about promoting a culture of savings and investments in the UK? That's been a question that we've asked for many years, since actually day one, since I joined PIMFA nearly 9 years ago, but also before that. That was a fundamental question. How do we promote a culture of savings and investments in the UK? And there's real opportunity out there. So if we're already looking after 1.6 trillion of savings and investments, there's some further things that we need to go for that will really help individuals and the economy and UK growth. So there's 9.7 million people who have got over £10,000 in investable assets. There is 200 billion that is sitting in cash in NS&I products. And there's over 1.8 trillion in savings accounts up and down the country. So that is a real opportunity for us to consider. Now, there is a perception that investment is only for the wealthy, and we disagree with that. Auto-enrolment actually made everybody an investor. And they're going to be looking after and having control over substantial sums of money at some point in their lives, either now or in the future. And we think it's only fair that they should have some real options. Excuse me. This is a byproduct of government policy, which then we think we need to accept means that the mass market are now able to accumulate wealth. So we think then that individuals can earn more, can save more, and with the right conditions can invest more in the UK. We also think that there are some other conditions that we need, however. We need a level playing field. We need opportunities for institutional investors and retail investors. And we also need a regulatory framework which is proportionate and which is balanced. We've got the Financial Services Markets Bill and some of the Edinburgh reforms, which we think give us an opportunity to address some of these things and some of these challenges. So we were delighted to commission the CPS to do some thinking around these key areas, these key questions, and in particular, as I say, this fundamental how do we promote a culture of savings and investments in the UK? And we were talking earlier on to one of your US colleagues about the difference in culture between the UK and the US, which of course most of us, if we've ever been in a taxi in the US, absolutely get that the moment we step into said cab. We really, really welcome the report that is launched today, very aptly named Retail Therapy. I'm not going to give you any spoilers, except that what's really appealing is the ask for a dedicated retail investment strategy, which we think sets a really ambitious and optimistic tone for retail investing and retail investors. Very much looking forward to hearing the views of the Minister and the perceptions on how we can reform financial services regulation that will really unlock investment and growth and also enable us to do things slightly differently. But before that, I'm going to hand back to Nick with our grateful thanks for all of the hard work that you and your team have done. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. It occurred to me when I was sitting down that I didn't actually introduce myself, so I hope it's fairly obvious who I am, but just in case it isn't, I am the author of said report, Nick King, and a Research Fellow at the CPS, so I hope that's cleared it up for anyone who was confused. I want to base my remarks today not really about sort of going through the report in detail, because I hope it sort of speaks for itself, but setting it slightly in the context of sort of conservative thinking in particular. So I want to base my comments around the quotes from 4 great conservative thinkers, and we'll start with Noel Skelton. And as many of you all know, Skelton is credited with having pushed the idea of a property-owning democracy as a key tenet of conservatism. And in 1924, he said that private property is the sine qua non of all progressive civilisations. But his wider arguments were not just about property, but about ownership more generally. And he said the ambition was to help the state, to help the citizen, to help himself. And that really is the spirit of what this report is all about, making the case for why it's important both economically, but also ideologically, for individual people to invest their money in the public markets. My second quote is from the late, great Nigel Lawson. And as he said, when talking about the ownership of shares, he said that this is in harmony with the deepest instincts of the British people. And that was a truism in the 1980s, and it was the intellectual underpinning behind the mass privatisations of that decade. And as this report makes clear, in the 1980s, shareholding soared, wealth was shared, and politicians and people at large were very happy to tell Sid about the value of share ownership. But things have changed since then, and as this report also says, the percentage of UK shares owned by UK retail investors has been falling ever since. And in part, I think that's because of the relative attractiveness of the UK to institutional investors, and that's obviously a good thing. But increasingly, it's also because UK citizens don't think about putting their money into the UK stock market. Now, that might not be a big problem if this money was invested elsewhere, but as Liz says, often is held in cash. And recent estimates have suggested there's more than £2 trillion worth of cash savings up and down the UK. And that's more than the total market capitalisation of the FTSE 100. And as Liz has also said, FCA figures show that there are millions of people with investable assets, millions of whom want to take some form of investment risk, but aren't sure how to do so at the moment. So why are people staying away? Well, we argue in this report that it's partly about attitudes and awareness, and it's partly about systems and structures. And one of the main issues that we identify is about our attitude to risk as a country. In my view, in this country, we've become far too risk averse. Right across the board. In the context of this report, that risk aversion means that straightforward investment opportunities are dressed up in all sorts of off-putting regulatory warnings. And we've become so keen to protect retail investors from the downside that we don't expose them to the upside. And it's small wonder that would-be investors are put off when having the message your capital is at risk is rammed down their throats on a consistent basis. That moves me on to the third quote from a great conservative, which is Hayek. And Hayek once asked, is there a greater tragedy imaginable that in our endeavour to shape our future in accordance with high ideals, we should in fact unwittingly produce the very opposite of what we've been striving for? At the moment, I will contend the regulation is harming the very people it's meant to protect. So this report aims to put forward a series of steps that we can take to do something about that and to encourage more people into the public markets. We suggest changing the tax treatment of retail investing to make it more attractive. We suggest either abolishing or at least watering down regulatory warnings. We suggest changing the rules to widen access to investment advice and to ensure that retail investors get a fair crack of the whip in IPOs. And we suggest amalgamating cash and stocks and shares ISAs to make equity investing a more obvious opportunity. But we also argue that government, its regulators and others should take a more proactive role to increase retail investing and increase the number of retail investors. And that's why we've argued that it should create a retail investment strategy, as Liz said. And that strategy should aim to replicate the success of initiatives like the American Own Your Share campaign of the post-war period and Telseid here in the 1980s, with a modern, up-to-date campaign that could get more people investing and excited about the opportunities of public markets. That brings me on to my final quote from another great Conservative thinker, our very own Andrew Griffith. Just last week, he told a conference, "Come back, Sid, we want to make it easier and better to invest." That was music to my ears, and that ambition is exactly what this report is all about. It's great that Andrew, as Economic Secretary to the Treasury, is a fellow traveller in this regard. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Andrew to tell us a bit more about how we might bring back Sid. Andrew.
Well, thank you, Nick, and it's a delight to be here at the wonderful Centre for Policy Studies. It's the home of such important thinking in the Conservative tradition. So let me start with the conclusion, if I may, so we know exactly where we're going. Wider share ownership is good for savers, it's good for the economy, and it's good for society. Outside of the European Union, we've got the opportunity to knock down some of those regulatory barriers, to help individuals make their money work harder for them, and at the same time, to make it easier for entrepreneurs and businesses to raise their investment here in the UK. However, as Nick said, increasing individual share ownership is also about changing culture, attitudes to risk, and supporting that most conservative of things, individual responsibility. And that's why I welcome this timely report by the respected Centre for Policy Studies, produced in support by PIMFA. At the CPS, you know that you can't tax your way to success, and you can't regulate your way to growth. Sustainable economic growth, that thing that we all need, can only come from private enterprise. And it's the ferocious problem-solving power of business and capital, often working with government, that we need if we're to tackle so many of the challenges in society, whether how we finance an ageing population, the transition to a low-carbon economy, or, Nick, building the homes for young people that the nation needs in the right places, of course. Greater individual share ownership would go a long way to increasing the understanding of private enterprise in society. It's important, my one quote, but it's important because, as Hayek said in The Road to Serfdom, the system of private property is the most important guarantee of freedom, not only for those who own property, but scarcely less for those who do not. If the overwhelming middle-class protesters gluing their hands to the nation's roads and runways actually knew whose dividends were funding their trust funds and pensions, we might have a more lucid conversation about how we finance the transition to clean energy. And if the electorate understood just how dependent our public services were on taxes paid by businesses, there might be less of a clamour to heap more regulation onto business at every turn. Research done by Delta Poll last year for the Tony Blair Institute, not something I often cite, but it revealed a worryingly large gulf between perception and reality. When asked how much profit was made for every £100 that customers spend on the services provided by public utility providers, this is very topical, public perception was out by an enormous factor. And we aren't talking about pence. There were massive misperceptions. For the water industry, respondents thought it was £52 of profit made for every £100 on a customer's bill. When asked what they thought was fair, the average was £27 per £100. But as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, the actual profit per £100 was just £4. How do you have a rational debate on something where public perceptions are so far off? Americans may not understand football. It still isn't called soccer. But they have a much stronger culture, as we heard, of personal investing and knowing what's in your portfolio. There are conversations happening right now about personal investing in Bristol, Cambridge and Manchester. But I'm talking about Bristol, Tennessee, Cambridge, Massachusetts and the New Hampshire town of Manchester. In the US, you find people talking about their 401k, their individual retirement account, in a bar or at a barbecue, in a way that's simply unimaginable here. It could be because the weather in the UK is not quite enough for those long summer barbecues, but I think, as Nick said, this is much more likely a cultural difference, and one that we should collectively seek to turn the tide on. Because retail investing is good for society. It fosters a greater understanding of business and investment and helps encourage investment, improves liquidity. And that in turn helps companies raise capital to grow, creating a virtuous circle where everybody wins. Private investors are good for market health too. They contribute to the depth and breadth of markets, often in ways that index-hugging institutions who manage huge amounts of our money simply do not. Retail investors generally have a long-term time horizon, and they tend to hold their shares for extended periods, stabilising markets in times of volatility. If we're going to get a wider societal uptake of investment, one key place to start is the availability of financial advice and guidance, as it's sometimes referred to. An unintended, perhaps foreseeable, but an unintended consequence of regulations and a culture of risk aversion and a claims culture has been to make the cost of financial advice prohibitive. It is out of reach of all of those other than those who are already wealthy. So as part of our Edinburgh reforms, which take forward our vision for the UK to be the world's most innovative and competitive and open global financial market, I've been pleased with the insightful conversations that I've had with the industry on that issue to date. So today I'm pleased to announce that the government and the FCA will publish a joint policy paper in the autumn to outline our initial plans regarding options for reform and the next steps. If any reform is to be successful in supporting more individuals to plan effectively for their retirement or encourage a greater acceptance of risk from both industry investors, and through this, consumers feeling empowered to put their assets to more productive uses and not leave them to be eroded in cash. A key part of this puzzle is therefore changing attitudes towards investing and to risk. At the moment, as this report clearly lays out, the UK is de-equitising due to a lower risk appetite for investors. The UK has the lowest percentage of retail assets under management of any European country at just 21%. And despite having over 9 million people with investable assets of over £10,000, only 12% of UK residents hold shares in our capital markets. That means 88% do not. That is something I want to change. As the responsible minister, I want to make equities sexy again. That will include rebalancing risk, because risk is part of the lifeblood of the enterprising economy that we seek. And equities often offer greater returns for investors and will help us fund growth areas of the UK economy. So we need to speak positively about the opportunities of retail investment for savers and those raising capital alike. That is why we've taken action in response to Lord Jonathan Hill's report, also of the CPS parish, his listing review recommendations, which were aimed at boosting the UK as a destination for listings. For one, we are simplifying the documents that firms need to list. When I worked in the city, it says 20 years ago, but I might have rounded that down a bit, 48 pages was a long prospectus, 48 pages. Now they run to multiple volumes, which nobody but the lawyers read. It's needless red tape, plain and simple. So we are right now drafting legislation to remove unnecessary burdens, make these documents shorter and more useful, and therefore support more people, including retail investors, to invest in the UK. There's more to do, and that's why we're looking closely at how we improve our research capability to ensure that companies listed in London are properly valued and understood by investors. I have nothing more to say on that now, but watch this space. In the near future, we will. It's also why the Chancellor has highlighted the opportunity to unlock the trillions of pounds held in pension schemes to boost returns for long-term savers. And it's why we will repeal the EU's overly burdensome PRIPS regulation. If you know it, you probably don't love it. And put in place a new UK simpler regime to ensure that retail investors can make well-informed decisions. That's what markets need to operate on, but also to make that process of understanding companies more simple. Nick, there's one final point I wanted to make. One of the great successes of investments are ISAs. To be clear, this government love ISAs. They are a tremendous innovation, celebrating their 24th birthday this year. No income tax, no capital gains tax. You don't even need to report them on your tax return. It's a very CPS-like idea. Around 67 billion was subscribed to adult ISAs in 21-22. Good number. But of that total amount subscribed, 47% was invested in cash. And for many savers, that may not be the best answer. In fact, I've seen research that says fewer than half of Britons even know what a stocks and shares ISA is. So if I leave us with one collective challenge, it's to continue to make a noise about ISAs, core part of retail investing, a core part of how we can drive more retail therapy in this market. Ladies and gentlemen, Nick and Lisa, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you to the CPS and to PIMFA for this report. We'll go forward from today and look at how we can realise the ambitions that you set out. I desire a fresh approach, one that does make it easier for people to invest, for companies to raise capital, and I and this government will be on the side of those who seek to see individual retail investment increase.